This video is sponsored by KiwiCo. More about them later on.
Hello, I'm Joshua Levine, and today I'm doing a deep dive into Blackadder Goes Forward, which is the fourth in the Blackadder series.
You mean the moment's finally arrived for us to give Harry Hun a darn good British-style thrashing, 6 of the best, trousers down?
This one is about the First World War.
I heard that it started when a bloke called Archie Duke shot an ostrich because he was hungry.
It's got Rowan Atkinson, Tony Robinson, Tim McInerney, lots of great people, and it's an exaggerated comedy about the First World War. I think it's brilliant, so let's go.
Tally-ho, Pip-Pip and Bernard's your uncle.
In English we say good morning.
Look what I got for you, sir.
What?
It's the latest issue of King and Country. Oh, damn inspiring stuff. The magazine that tells the Tommies the truth about the war.
Or alternatively, the greatest work of fiction since Vows of Fidelity were included in the French marriage service.
Here we have a propaganda magazine that Hugh Laurie is looking at, and it gives a sense of how the British were fed news stories about the war. Hugh Laurie loves it, Rowan Atkinson doesn't.
Well, look at it. I mean, the stuff's about as convincing as Dr. Crippen's defence lawyer. The British Tommies are all portrayed as 6'6" with biceps the size of Bournemouth.
Thoroughly inspiring stuff.
It's too simplistic to say troops were positive or negative about the war. They felt differently at different times. The same people might, for example, at the beginning of the war, have been positive about it. You know, they would have gone down to do their bit and would have enjoyed a lot of what happened. You know, they were living lives that they couldn't have dreamed of before. They were going abroad, they were getting regular meals, they were having adventurous times, and for a lot of people this was new and exciting. But then, of course, as the war developed, as it became this monotonous trench warfare, it was much more difficult to put up with. So, were troops positive about the war? Yes, and for a lot of the time, clearly, no. There was a lot of propaganda around. There were magazines and newspapers which were, you know, painting the war in a particular light. I've got examples here, which I think give a flavour. This is a magazine called The War Illustrated from 1917. There are various stories in it. You know, one is from a prisoner of war camp about a typical German, you know, brutal German, talking about how one of his comrades, a small man, fell out of line, and this man struck the wretched little man with a blow under the ear that would have felled an ox. And it talks about how brutal this man was, how typical he was of a German, and then how he walked away, and it didn't matter while the little man could barely stand up. There's an article about the war in the air. The Germans were doing pretty much the same as the British in the air. People were actually, relatively speaking, it was a friendly atmosphere between the two British airmen and German airmen, or at least relatively speaking. And yet the headline here is Huns glorify their air murderers and machines. The British were doing precisely the same. And then a little article here, same magazine. This is all from one particular edition. Man's eternal birthright. While the war has brought us poignant grief, I believe it should prove our salvation as an empire. So the fact is here, we're completely in the right, anybody else is completely in the wrong, and in fact, as human beings, we're superior.
My instincts lead me to deduce that we are at last about to go over the top.
Great stotter! You mean the moment's finally arrived for us to give Harry Hun a darn good British-style thrashing, 6 of the best, trousers down?
Are we all going to get killed? Yes. Clearly, Field Marshal Haig is about to make yet another gargantuan effort to move his drinks cabinet 6 inches closer to Berlin.
So they're talking about going over the top. Basically what that meant was you were massed in your frontline trench, and when the whistle was blown by the officers, you went over. And your aim was to basically get to the enemy trench, but to do that you had to get through withering gunfire, machine gun fire, all kinds of things. And, well, depending on the time and the place, your chances, well, often they were limited. So what we see there is basically the attitude to going over the top. And the reactions, again, kind of varied. The fact was, as the war went on, people did dread this. It was the most dangerous thing they could possibly do. People new to the front sometimes did look forward to it. They were young men, they did sometimes see it as an adventure. So, I have accounts of people. I arrived and I was naive, I was really looking forward to it. Others absolutely dreaded it because the casualty figures on some of the attacks were absolutely immense. The Battle of the Somme on the first day, the numbers who were casualties and the numbers who weren't, they were roughly equal. So it was something that was very much feared.
Throughout history, and especially in the world of Blackadder, success often comes down to having a cunning plan, a clever bit of problem solving, or a key invention to help you get out of a tough spot. Now, whilst Baldrick's turnip-based creations may not be the best of examples, It's that same spirit of hands-on innovation that makes today's video sponsor, KiwiCo, so fantastic. They create their own project crates that are all about building your own solutions and understanding how things work. Now, I didn't have my coffee this morning, so I went to try and build this children's crate. It's an archery set, and I think I did a pretty good job. I've got my bow and arrow here, ready to go to the fields of Agincourt. If you'd like to spark that same spirit of invention, I genuinely think you're going to love KiwiCo. And you can support the channel too, using code HistoryHit at kiwico.com/historyhit to get 50% off your first monthly crate. Link is in the top of the description below. Now, back to the video.
How about a nice meal while you chew it over?
What's on the menu?
Rat. Sauté or fricassee?
Oh, the agony of choice. Sautéed involves?
Well, you take the freshly shaved rat and you marinate it in a puddle for a while.
Mm-hmm. For how long?
Till it's drowned. Then you stretch it out under a hot light bulb. Then you get within dashing distance of the latrine and you scoff it right down.
So that's sautéing and fricasseing?
Exactly the same, just a slightly bigger rat.
Well, call me old Mr. Unadventurous, but I think I'll give it a miss this one.
So, eating a rat. I certainly have found an example of Belgian civilians eating a horse as soon as it was shot. But the fact is, in the trenches, conditions very much varied. A lot of the time, during winter, when it was wet, at Passchendaele, for example, the conditions were absolutely appalling. And when they were like that, the food was affected. If your food was basically wet, muddy, you couldn't eat it, then life became truly awful. A lot of the time, actually, the food wasn't too terrible in the trenches. People made the best of what they had. Often you had tins of meat or stew. Makanokis was probably the most well-known one. And if you ate it cold, it was utterly disgusting. If you had it warm, it was palatable. You had other things. You had treats very often. People would send you from home chocolates, fruit cakes. Officers did very well. Officers. There are accounts of officers having accounts with Harrods and sort of hampers coming from Harrods. Also, people got a ration of rum every day, which a lot of people really looked forward to. It wasn't much, about a 16th of a pint. A ration of tobacco, because almost everybody smoked in those days. Some of the officers, had cocaine and heroin. We don't tend to remember that, but it was, a different time. So it kind of varied, sometimes miserable, sometimes not. But you've got to remember also that people weren't used to particularly much back then. Ordinary people had to put up with a hard life at home. So even though very often the conditions were utterly appalling, there were periods when people were out of the line where, they could go to estaminets, go to brothels, they could, have a decent time.
Now, Field Marshal Haig has formulated a brilliant new tactical plan to ensure final victory in the field.
Would this brilliant plan involve us climbing out of our trenches and walking very slowly towards the enemy, sir?
How could you possibly know that, Blackadder? It's classified information.
It's the same plan that we used last time, and the 17 times before that.
Exactly. And that is what is so brilliant about it. It will catch the watchful Hun totally off guard. Doing precisely what we've done 18 times before is exactly the last thing they'll expect us to do this time. There is, however, one small problem.
That everyone always gets slaughtered in the first 10 seconds.
That's right. And Field Marshal Haig is worried that this may be depressing the men attached. So, he's looking to find a way to cheer them up.
Interesting. There was a disconnect between the upper echelons and the men, clearly. There always was going to be. And, there are lots of songs, the private hanging on the old barbed wire, about the fact that the generals are living well and the men are being sacrificed. So absolutely, that view, the view, lions led by donkeys, the view of the war poets, absolutely, it's not made up. There were a lot of people who felt that way. But obviously, like all these things, it's a simplification. I don't think it was generally a case of lions led by donkeys. I think the upper echelons, they were in many ways detached. Not all of them. Some of them came down, to meet the soldiers, to meet the junior officers. But it was a mixed bag. And yes, certainly, much of the war, troops were thrown into situations where, they'd simply failed before and there wasn't much chance of getting through. But then at the same time, generals did learn their lessons from what went before. And, it did become a different war once the lessons had been learned. And, when the Americans came in 1918, just to show, they had no idea what was going on. They were using outdated tactics because they hadn't learned. So to single out the British officers, I think, is not quite fair.
Now that you are our official war artist, we can give you the full briefing. The fact is, Blackadder, that the King and Country cover story was just a cover story. We want you, as our top painting bod, to leave the trenches tonight.
Suits me.
And go out into no man's land.
No man's land.
Yes.
Not Paris.
No. We want you to come back with accurate drawings of the enemy positions.
You want me to sit in no man's land, painting pictures of the Germans?
Precisely. Good man.
Well, it's a very attractive proposition, gentlemen, but unfortunately not practical. You see, my medium is light. It'll be pitch dark. I won't be able to see a thing.
That is a point. I tell you what, we'll send up a couple of flares. You'll be lit up like a Christmas tree.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Glad I checked.
All right, total and utter quiet. Do you understand? So, for instance, if any...
So we've seen a clip of them going out into no man's land to paint the German lines. Clearly, that didn't happen. But actually, it sort of did, because most of the reconnaissance, once trench warfare was underway, was done by aeroplanes. And at the very beginning, these airplanes would take up observers who really did draw the trenches, draw the lines of trenches. And then they got cameras, and the cameras became more developed, and they were able to take photographs from above at regular intervals, which they then placed together down on the ground and created this amazing mosaic map, which was incredibly complex and detailed, which the intelligence officers were then able to read, and they could tell so much about the front lines and the rear from what came. So, you know, obviously, it's an exaggeration that they went out to paint the front lines, but also they were going out to have a look at the front lines. I mean, you know, they were sending patrols out, a lot, incredibly dangerous patrols. And the job of these patrols was to have a look at the enemy lines, to see the lay of the land, to find out which unit was there and how well defended was there. These would go out at night. It was too dangerous to go out into no man's land during the day. So, as so much in Blackadder, clearly they didn't go out on a painting expedition, but at the same time, you know, it's based in reality, and it's also, you know, really fun to watch.
I suppose Blackadder and his boys will have gone over the top by now, sir.
Yes, God, I wish I was out there with them, dodging the bullets instead of having to sit here drinking this Chateau Lafite and eating these filet mignon with sauce béarnaise.
My thoughts exactly, sir. Damn this Chateau Lafite.
A lot of generals, a lot of staff officers would have been living in, you know, relative comfort, sometimes in chateaus. So yeah, that is absolutely true. And from the Tommy's perspective, a lot of the time, that would simply have looked unfair.
Captain Blackadder speaking. No, I'm afraid the line's very...
Hello? Hello, Captain Blackadder, hello?
Schnell, schnell, Kartoffelkopf.
I said, there's a terrible line at my end. You're to advance on the enemy at once.
A wandering minstrel, Gale Force 8.
So, communications. There were lots of different ways people communicated during the First World War. Field telephones, for example, which were very useful from behind the lines forward. The cables would be often shot up by artillery fire, so, you know, they failed. But there were wireless transmissions possible. So, for example, you know, aeroplanes could communicate with the ground using wireless, although the ground tended not to communicate with the aeroplanes using wireless. But, you know, they could be, wireless communication was possible. Even voice communication, wireless voice communication was possible during the war. It wasn't used so much.
So come on, sir, what's the message? I'm on tenterhooks, do tell.
Well, as far as I can tell, the message was he's got a terrible lion up his end, so there's an advantage to an enema at once.
Damn.
Message from HQ, sir.
Ah, now this'll be it. A telegram ordering in advance.
Yes, I'm afraid not, George. It is a telegram, it is ordering in advance, but it seems to be addressed to someone called Catpain Blackadder. Do you know a Catpain Blackadder, George?
Well, it rings a bell, but no.
No, me neither.
Oh, well.
Don't worry, George. I'm sure if they want to contact us, they'll find a way.
Pigeon, sir. Pigeon. There's a pigeon in our trench.
Ah, now this'll be it. Yes, it's one of the King's carrier pigeons.
No, it isn't. That pigeon couldn't carry the king. Hasn't got a tray or anything.
Carrier pigeons were used on a really big scale. I mean, that's not a myth. Dogs were used. Dogs were used as messengers. And actually, in some ways, were better than carrier pigeons. They were quicker, but they were often upset by shell fire, you know, unsurprisingly. Although when they were trained, they were actually given food whilst explosions were happening around them in order to get them used to explosions and to associate them actually with a treat. But, flares were used. People shot up flares, which, would mean different things. So when mounting an attack and soldiers had got to a certain point, they would shoot up flares sometimes to show how far they'd got, or they would put down markers so aeroplanes could see how far they'd got. Rockets were used with messages. Aeroplanes could drop messages. They had special bags that would drop messages. There really were all kinds of ways that people could communicate. And of course, perhaps the most basic were runners. People took messages. It was, a pretty basic way, but, sometimes you had no choice.
At this moment, you may consider yourself under arrest. You know what the penalty is for disobeying orders, Blackadder?
Court-martial followed by immediate cessation of chocolate rations?
No. Court-martial followed by immediate death by firing squad.
Oh, so I got it half right.
This is particularly interesting. I got some statistics here about firing squads, what people were executed for during the war. I think most of the time, the death penalty was commuted, ultimately. You see a lot of documents where they have been commuted by Douglas Haig or high-up generals. In the end, 346, we think, men were executed, although the figures do vary. 266 of them were for desertion, 37 were for murder, 18 were for cowardice, 7 for quitting a post without authority, 6 for striking or using violence against a superior officer, 5 for disobedience, 3 for mutiny, 2 at sleeping at post, and 2 for casting away arms. So there are things that stand out immediately. One is there's a real overlap between some of these things. And second, some seem incredibly harsh by our standards. For falling asleep, you could be executed. Wow. That's something really you have very little control over. Something you literally don't remember. And there you are, finding yourself in front of a firing squad. And I think that actually happened twice. Most of those were commuted, and some of those were dealt with on the spot, by the officers who found someone asleep, or the sergeant who found someone asleep, would realise that but putting in an official complaint would see that man potentially killed, so they would simply, mete out discipline there and then, or sometimes even not, just say, you bloody well stay awake. And the 2 who were executed for that, it was in Mesopotamia, and I think one thing that a lot of these have in common is the executions were ordered and confirmed at times when there was a need, perhaps discipline had grown lax, and there was a need actually to make a point to others. So these people weren't necessarily executed precisely for what they'd done. Others weren't, at different times. But in order to, well, as Voltaire says, pour encourager les autres, to make a point to others that this will happen to you, which seems incredibly unfair. And if you look online, you'll see soldiers, modern-day soldiers, saying, well, these were different times, but the point had to be made in different ways. It was made in our time that you couldn't fall asleep at post or whatever it was. And in some of these, you see, one example, a man called Ansted, who had been a war hero, but then he'd got clearly, terrible PTSD, as it was not called then, and, he'd run away 5 times. And he actually says to the padre, the night before his execution, he says, I'm glad I'm being shot tomorrow, because I will just do it again. In other words, I have no control over this. These were different times. Although you do find, for example, the war in the air, people were treated differently. They weren't executed. They were sent behind the lines. They were given, help in hospitals. And I think the difference is there that the commanding officers had actually been in that situation themselves recently and knew what the stresses were and weren't willing to do that to men who were clearly suffering.
Morning. I must say, Captain, I've got to admire your balls.
Perhaps later. So, boys, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Robinson, good to see you.
Good to see you too, sir.
Corporal, how's the voice?
Excellent, sir. Wait for it!
So, the phone's on the hook, isn't it, Perkins?
Oh, yes, sir.
Splendid. So, where do you want me?
Well, up against the wall is traditional, sir.
Of course it is. This side or the other side? No messengers waiting, Perkins?
Oh, I'm afraid not, sir.
Fair enough, fair enough.
All right, lads, line up.
Yes, now look, I think there might have been a bit of a misunderstanding here. You see, I was expecting a telegram. Quite an important one, actually. I think that's what they call the nick of time.
It's important also to note that these people did have trials. I mean, you know, there were court-martials, they would have been represented, but the result of it, you know, very much depended on what the mood was at the time. And so you couldn't necessarily say it was a fair trial.
Sir, it's all over the trenches!
Well, mop it up then.
No, sir, the news! The Russian Revolution has started! The masses have risen up and shot all their knobs!
Well, hurrah!
Oh, no, the bloody Russians have pulled out of the war.
Well, we soon saw them off, didn't we, sir? Miserable, slant-eyed, sausage-eating swine.
The Russians are on our side. And they've abandoned the Eastern Front.
And they've overthrown Nicholas II, who used to be bizarre.
Who used to be the Tsar, more than. The point is that now the Russians have made peace with the Kaiser. At this very moment, over 750,000 Germans are leaving the Russian front and coming over here with the express purpose of using my nipples for target practice. There's only one thing for it. I'm going to have to desert, and I'm going to do it right now.
We've got mention here of Russia, and Russia is interesting at this point because it pulls out of the war. You've had the revolution, the rise of Bolshevism. Because Russia pulls out, you've now got all those troops, German troops, able to move to the Western Front. So this is very worrying for the Allies. For that reason, you've got now a stronger Germany fighting them, but also because you've got communism coming to the fore in a European country, and that could easily spread. And to a degree it does spread. I mean, you know, many people become communists in Britain. They see communism as the way forward, as a challenge to the status quo, of fairness. So there's a lot for the Allies to worry about here.
So on, I'll lend you my driver if you like. Bob!
Driver Parkhurst reporting for duty, sir.
All right, at ease, Bob. Stand easy. Captain Blackadder, this is Bob. Bob?
Good morning, sir.
Unusual name for a girl.
Well, yes, it would be an unusual name for a girl, but it's a perfectly straightforward name for a young chap like you, eh, Bob?
Yeah, Bob. Bob, who is clearly a woman, but pretends to be a man, and who Colonel Melchett actually thinks is a very unconvincing drag act. Well, women did actually fight in the front line. Unsurprisingly, it was the Russians who actually had a unit of women fighting alongside men, you know, snipers and frontline soldiers. And you do have examples of, you know, there's a British woman who pretends to be a man, gets to the front and actually serves only for 10 days or so, but seems to get away with it for 10 days or so before she gives herself in. There's another British woman who goes and serves with the Serbians, and did serve throughout the war. So there are examples, not many, but there are examples of women kind of either getting away with it or openly serving as women. And then there are lots of examples of people underage, you know, going and serving. You know, at least one person who was executed went out underage. And the youngest, it is thought, was a 12-year-old in Sydney who went out there pretending to be a 19-year-old, was thoroughly believed. And perhaps the most interesting thing about that is that his parents didn't seem to do anything about it for a long time, for about a year. Perhaps they noticed they must have noticed he was missing, but they didn't seem to question it very much. But he did serve for about a year.
They love him, sir. We're a hit.
Yes, in one short evening, I've become the most successful impresario since the manager of the Roman Colosseum thought of putting the Christians and the lions on the same bill.
They've just watched a concert party, which absolutely, you know, these did exist. All sorts of units had their own concert parties that gave entertainments behind the line. So I suppose the first thing to say is, you know, people were out of the line for considerable time, and they would have things to do. They would have, you know, they could watch films. Charlie Chaplin, you know, and others were incredibly popular, and they would go to these concert parties, which were made up of soldiers, and, you know, the women would be played by men. So, you know, one fantastic example I have is a man from the Middlesex Regiment who for a couple of years was a corporal, ordinary corporal, and then joined the Ace of Spades concert party and became first girl. So he spent half the war being a woman, and he was incredibly popular. You know, he sang songs, he did serious parts, he did reviews. He played Dolly Clare, and the colonel came to see the concert party, and he was told, can you guess which of those girls is a real girl? Of course, none of them were. He pointed out this man, his name was Tommy Keel, and was disgusted to find out that he was, in fact, a man. He used to do a line down the front here to make it look as if he had cleavage, and the colonel was disgusted, and, you know, what Tommy Keel said was, it's very interesting to listen to his interview in the Imperial War Museum. If you have a chance, do listen, because he talks about the fact he's so proud of having done this, and went into show business after the war, but he also complains about the fact that, you know, people thought he was gay, which at the time obviously was, you know, he saw as a great insult, whether he really was or not. He saw it as a great insult. So in his interview, he talks about the fact I was brilliant, you know, I looked like a woman, I was convincing, people loved me, I signed autographs, but I hated the fact that people thought that I was gay.
Eat knuckle, Fritz! Disgusting! A Bosch on the sole of my boot! I shall have to find a patch of grass to wipe it on. Probably get shunned in the officer's mess. Sorry about the pong, you fellas. Trod in a Bosch and can't get rid of the whiff.
Do you think we could dispense with the hilarious doggy-doo metaphor for a moment? Not a Bosch, this is a British trench.
Is it? Oh, that's a piece of luck. Thought I'd landed sausage sign. Ha!
So even people who only barely remember Blackadder Goes Forth remember Rick Mayall as Lord Flashheart. This is kind of an iconic performance. It's a pantomime performance, but it's totally brilliant. And it, you know, to a degree, it does reflect the view of soldiers about the flyers, and even to a degree, it, you know, does reflect who they were in the sense that, you know, at the beginning of the war, certainly, the sorts of people who became pilots were, a lot of them were people who'd flown before the war. They were kind of irreverent. They were, from a military point of view, undisciplined. You know, they were people who'd taken up this strange, dangerous, individualistic hobby before the war, and now were the people who found themselves, you know, going out to do this on the Western Front. So, you know, it's not entirely untrue that these people were different to the average military person in a lot of ways, particularly at the beginning of the war. Clearly, this is, you know, a comic exaggeration, but it's, you know, it's a totally brilliant one.
Well, I'll see you in 10 minutes for takeoff.
Hang on. What about the months of training?
Hey, wet pants! This isn't the Women's Auxiliary Balloon Corps. You're in the 20-minuters now.
Sir?
Yes, sir. Pratt at the back.
I think we'd all be intrigued to know why you called the 20-minuters.
Oh, Mr. Thicker, imagine not knowing that. Well, it's simple. The average life expectancy for a new pilot is 20 minutes.
Ah.
Life expectancy of 20 minutes.
That's right. Goggles on, chocks away, last one back's a homo. Hooray!
Flying was incredibly dangerous. I mean, what a lot of people don't know is that actually more people during the First World War died training than they did in actual combat. Flying was incredibly dangerous in these days. You know, engines were really, really unreliable, and airplanes were actually very lightweight, you know, wooden canvas. And, you know, I mean, obviously that was the technology, but at the same time, they were that because you had more chance of surviving if you hit the ground in something very light that would crumple. I've got a picture of an aeroplane that got stuck in a tree. You know, it looked like a kite. Having said that, you know, many, many people died. People were flying, you know, in combat against each other, the fighters known as the scouts, and it was very dangerous just doing the ordinary work, that the day-to-day work that the aeroplanes did in reconnaissance, in contact patrols, in artillery observation, this kind of thing. Now, there was a period during the Battle of Arras where it is said that the life expectancy of a pilot, new pilot arriving at the front, was 12 days. And you've got to this position where, you know, in a lot of squadrons, the new guys weren't really spoken to because the older members, you know, still thought fondly of their old comrades, and these new people coming in weren't likely to last very long. So why make any sort of emotional attachment with them? So it was a very dangerous thing to be doing. The payoff was that you lived a much more comfortable life, generally, than people at the front. You were often in a chateau or in a farmhouse or something much more comfortable, well behind the lines. You got much more opportunity to go into the towns for leisure, and, you know, for a lot of young people, this was incredibly exciting. I mean, you know, the very first flight had only been the end of 1903, and here you are a decade later, you know, doing the same thing.
Sir, look, I can see a pretty red plane from up here.
No, watch out, Baltic. It stood right on our tail.
Yes, so here is the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen.
Oh, damn, foiled again. What bad luck.
Ah, and the Lord Flashheart. This is indeed an honor. Finally, the two greatest gentlemen flyers in the world meet. Two men of honor who have jousted together in the cloud-strewn glory of the skies. Face to face at last. How often I have rehearsed this moment of destiny in my dreams. The valor be to encapsulate the unspoken nobility of a comradeship.
So, a real character. He was absolutely used for propaganda during the war. The Germans did use him. He was also a very effective pilot. I mean, he had lots and lots of kills. Actually, what he tended to do, he had two main aircraft during the war. One was an Albatross and one was the Fokker triplane. That's a really iconic one with the three wings. You know, he was built up to such status. What he used to do, actually, was sort of sit very high and then descend on British aeroplanes, and you know, he would take a lot of them out. And he was iconic. The British did fear him. They did respect him. The British pilots did. And he was actually, you know, his pastime in peacetime was hunting. And that's how he saw himself. He saw himself as a hunter. So he did become this kind of, you know, phenomenon, this icon. And the British copied it. You know, for a lot of the time, the British didn't turn their flying heroes into identifiable people whose faces were on cigarette cards. But that changed as the war went on. And the British aces and the man who shot down the first Zeppelin, these did become, you know, heroes. And it was natural they did, because these were face-to-face fighting, where most of the war was done at a distance and was impersonal. You had these people carrying out the classic dogfights. You know, the things that you see recreated in Star Wars. You know, they only really happened, you know, in the First World War. So von Richthofen was very famous. He was, like a lot of these pilots, kept at the front for a very long time, and in the end ended up dying breaking his own rules. British pilots did this as well. Very famous. You know, he wrote out a set of rules, and he died breaking rule number 2. And that was, don't fly low over enemy territory. He did this chasing a novice pilot. He was very, very low. He decided to turn back, which he did. He was being chased by Canadian airmen called Brown, and it was said for a long time that Brown shot him down. In fact, he probably didn't. Pretty clear from the angle that the bullet went in at his side that he was hit either by an Australian machine gunner on the ground or Australian soldiers with rifles, probably a man called Popkin, who was a machine gunner. And he died, and he was given, you know, a huge, almost a state funeral. I mean, that's the kind of way these people lived. He was feared, but he was also respected. And in this clip, you know, this brilliant clip, you know, he's shot by Lord Flashheart while he's talking about the, you know, the camaraderie, the kind of chivalry between pilots on either side. And that chivalry did, to a degree, exist. You know, when German pilots were shot down, they were taken to the squadron of the person who shot them down for a night before they were taken into prisoner of war camp, where they were entertained. So it's not wholly a myth that there was this, you know, chivalry in the air.
With my little eye, something beginning with M. Oh, I say, well done, sir. Your turn.
I spy with my bored little eye something beginning with T.
Breakfast.
What?
My breakfast always begins with tea.
Well, we see them there being very, very bored, and I think it's fair to say that life in the trenches probably was a mixture of sort of boredom, intense discomfort, danger. I don't think a good time was had by many. You know, there were high points in the day when they got their rum in the morning. Meals were incredibly important, you know. They looked forward to their meals beyond probably anything else. There was a great deal of discomfort, and also there were very boring jobs to be done, you know, cleaning the trench and cleaning their weapons and carrying things, you know, to and fro. Sentry duty was, you know, pretty boring, but also it had that element of danger, because you might, you know, see men coming. It was very difficult not to fall asleep, and if you fell asleep, you were on a charge. Could be, you know, could be fatal. I think it is true that there was a great deal of boredom during the day, but there was also, you know, your mind was probably taken off it a lot of the time by the intense discomfort, which was worse, and by the danger. Every so often, you would be attacked. There were shells coming in, there were snipers, there were areas of the trenches where you had to be very, very careful, you had to duck your head. If you were new into the trench, you didn't know the routine, because there was, you know, there was a way of living, a way of surviving, and you might put others in danger if you didn't know how to behave. So, you know, life in the trenches wasn't pleasant, and absolutely it could be boring.
Captain Blackadder was marvellous. He joked and joked, "You lucky, lucky, lucky bastard," he cried. And then he lay on his back, stuck his foot over the top of the trench, and shouted, "Over here, Fritz! What about me? What about me?"
Hello, darling. What are you doing here?
Bullet in the foot.
Well, I can understand people up the front trying to shoot themselves in the foot, but when you're 35 miles behind the line...
I did not shoot myself. The general did it.
Finally got fed up with you, did he?
No, it was a mistake.
So it's absolutely true that people did expose themselves to limited danger. People shot themselves in the foot. They tried to inhale cordite. They tried to do things that would wound them, injure them, make them ill, to a degree that they had to be sent home, but not to a degree that they would be permanently damaged. So, you know, being shot in the foot or the hand would do that, and the authorities were very, very alert to the fact that people might have caused self-inflicted wounds, as they were called, and people, got into huge trouble. Potentially they could be executed for giving themselves a self-inflicted wound. And, that's reflected by the fact that, the vast majority of people clearly never did that. But so many were hoping for what they called a blighty wound. That was something, again, that was bad enough to get you sent home. Ideally, bad enough to keep you at home, to be discharged from the army, but not bad enough to affect your life going forward. So, of course, it's not true to say that everybody wanted a blighty wound, but certainly many people were open to the possibility that they could be sent home and taken out of the war.
What the General means, Blackadder, is there's a leak.
Now, leak is a positively disgusting word.
The Germans seem to be able to anticipate our every move. We send up an airplane, there's a Jerry squadron parked behind the nearest cloud. We move troops to Boulogne, the Germans have bought the entire town supply of lavatory paper. In short, a German spy is giving away every one of our battle plans.
You look surprised, Blackadder.
I certainly am, sir. I didn't realize we had any battle plans.
Well, of course we have. How else do you think the battles are directed?
Our battles are directed, sir.
Well, of course they are, Blackadder, directed according to the grand plan.
Would that be the plan, to continue with total slaughter until everyone's dead except Field Marshal Haig, Lady Haig, and their tortoise, Alan?
Great Scott!
Well, there were spies in the First World War, just like there were spies in basically every single war. Tended not to be, Germans getting across the lines because, very difficult to do. It tended more to be people suspected behind the lines, local French people who were somehow reporting back to the Germans, going backwards and forwards, and, they were usually dealt with pretty summarily. People were shot. Spies were looking for troop movements, for defences, for weak points in the British line, for plans. They were trying to get intelligence, the same way that, the British were trying to get intelligence on the other side.
Werner, you're a filthy Hun spy, aren't you? Baldrick the Cocker Spaniel, please!
No, wait! Look, I'm English! I was born in Croydon. I was educated at Iblethorpe Primary School. I've got a girlfriend called Doris. I know the words to all 3 verses of God Save the King.
4 verses.
4 verses! I meant 4 verses! Look, I'm as British as Queen Victoria!
So your father's German, you're half German, and you married a German?
No, for God's sake, I'm not a German spy!
Good, thanks very much. Send the next man.
You've got this idea here that, the royal family actually wasn't British, so maybe it was kind of looked down on by the people. And in fact, for George V, at this time, this was a real issue. I mean, in 1917, the family name was changed from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, and, he really was worried. This was a period, bear in mind that, German shops, or, Germans who'd been in Britain for a long time were in danger. So why should the royal family be any different? So what he did was try to make the royal family into this incredibly sympathetic, empathizable with, typical British family, that suffer the same deprivations that ordinary British people suffer, the same shortages, tiny bit of water in their bathtubs, all this kind of thing. And, he went to the lengths of actually organising a big event for wounded soldiers at Buckingham Palace. Thousands of wounded soldiers came in. They didn't have to stand for the King and Queen when they came in. There was no playing of the national anthem. And all these wounded men were served by members of the aristocracy in aprons. And they were entertained by Charlie Chaplin, by Harry Lauder. The point being, we are just like you.
I mean, he died.
Oh, I'm sorry.
He was test driving one of those new tank contraptions and the bloody thing blew up. What a waste. God, I hope they've scrapped the lot.
Fat chance. They're going to use 40 of them next week at... Oh, sorry, I mustn't talk about that. You never know who might be listening.
No, of course.
Tanks were introduced during the First World War. They first came in on the Somme in 1916. They were not particularly reliable. They moved at 2 miles an hour at first. I mean, they were really slow. The idea was that they could... Defences that really were pretty impregnable, most of the time, barbed wire or ditches, could be crossed by these huge, great land ships, called tanks because they were such a secret. They were said to be initially huge, moving tanks of water. And at first, their real... The advantage they had was they terrified. I mean, they terrified the living bejesus out of the enemy. I had no idea what this was suddenly coming at them. So, units actually surrendered as soon as they saw these things. They thought, some amazing, miraculous thing had appeared. Over time, they did become more reliable, and they also started to be used in conjunction, properly in conjunction with the infantry, with the artillery, with the flying corps, the air force. So they improved over time. I mean, obviously they never became the fighting weapon that they were in the Second World War. But they were, you know, pretty amazing advance.
The thing is, the way I see it, these days there's a war on, right? And ages ago there wasn't a war on, right? So there must have been a moment when there not being a war on went away, right? And there being a war on came along. So what I want to know is, how did we get from the one case of affairs to the other case of affairs?
Do you mean, how did the war start?
Yeah.
The war started because of the vile Hun and his villainous empire building.
You know, if you look at propaganda magazines, if you look at actually what soldiers were told, and the reason they queued to join up, or one of the reasons they queued to join up, you know, quite apart from white feathers and peer pressure and all the rest, was that it was a very clear-cut situation. The Germans were bad, the Germans were committing atrocities, the Germans wanted to take over, and the British were the good guys. As with all these things, there's an element of truth to it. It's not, you know, it's not total nonsense. That you know, there was a sense that the war. Well, let's have a look at what Rowan Atkinson has to say.
George, the British Empire at present covers a quarter of the globe, while the German Empire consists of a small sausage factory in Tanganyika. I hardly think that we can be entirely absolved from blame on the imperialistic front.
Oh, no, sir, absolutely not. Man's a bicycle.
I heard that it started when a bloke called Archie Duke shot an ostrich because he was hungry.
I think you mean it started when the Archduke of Austro-Hungary got shot.
No, there was definitely an ostrich involved.
So that's a killing of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he's referring to, by Gavrilo Princip. And that was considered the kind of spark that set the war off. But actually, it was a kind of gamesmanship, really. You know, each side went a bit further, until they got to a stage where war pretty much was inevitable. But I don't think actually it's right. Well, first of all, Rowan Atkinson is right to say that the German Empire was much smaller than the British Empire at this point. But of course that was part of the problem, because Germany did want a sizable empire. Germany was a new country, actually, and you know, it wanted to expand, it wanted to exert its power. And that kind of was a problem for the British, both in terms of, you know, the British didn't want to lose their importance, but also, you know, Germany was, you know, seriously threatening the world order. It was being aggressive. So, you know, arguably, you know, Britain did have, you know, both a moral and a strategic duty to resist. So, like everything, these things aren't straightforward.
Well, possibly. But the real reason for the whole thing was that it was just too much effort not to have a war.
By gum, this is interesting. I always loved history. Oh, Battle of Hastings, Henry VIII and his 6 knives, all that.
You see, Boric, in order to prevent war in Europe, 2 superblocks developed. Us, the French and the Russians on one side, and the Germans and Austro-Hungary on the other. The idea was to have 2 vast opposing armies, each acting as the other's deterrent. That way, there could never be a war.
But this is a sort of a war, isn't it, sir?
Yes, that's right. You see, there was a tiny flaw in the plan.
What was that, sir?
It was bollocks.
This is really interesting, because actually he's kind of, this is 1989, I think, and filmed in 1989. And bear in mind that the Cold War was just coming to an end. So I think there we've got this comparison, these 2 blocks, you know, who cancelled each other out. I think there's a kind of, you know, parodic point being made there that this doesn't work. Although you could argue that the Cold War proved that it sometimes could work. Yeah, so really interesting. I mean, it's, you know, it's a kind of simplistic view there of how the war started, but it makes its point. You know, the idea that it got to a stage where he says, you know, it was too much bother to stop the war. Well, it certainly got to a tipping point where the war kind of couldn't be stopped anymore. So there's some truth in that, but you can, you know, looking back, apportion responsibility, and, you know, that's what historians are for. A lot of the soldiers would really have no idea at all why they were there. You know, at the beginning of the war, a lot of people were keen to go. They were fed a lot of propaganda about what was happening, very simplistic propaganda, not necessarily completely untrue, but I suppose a lot of people wouldn't really have cared very much if they even noticed.
Then, shortly after, we all met up, didn't we, just before Christmas, 1914?
Yes, that's right. I just arrived and we had that wonderful Christmas truce. Do you remember, sir? You could hear Silent Night drifting across the still, clear air of no man's land. And then they came, the Germans, emerging out of the freezing night mist, calling to us. And we clambered up over the top and went to meet them.
Both sides advanced more during one Christmas piss-up than they managed in the next 2.5 years of war.
Do you remember the football match?
Remember it? How could I forget it? I was never offside. I could not believe that
And since then, we've been stuck here for 3 flipping years. We haven't moved. All my friends are dead.
Okay, so there was a Christmas truce in 1914. It really did happen at parts of the line. To say that, you know, we moved further forward, I mean, you know, arguably the trench lines were so sort of set, attritional for so much of the war. Probably true in some places. They moved more during that truce than they did for long periods elsewhere. There's, you know, pretty verifiable stories, for example, of a British soldier cutting the hair of a German soldier and all sorts of things, you know, exchanging photographs. There's no verifiable evidence of a football match. That is a story that's come down. People do talk about it happening, but there's no evidence of a British versus the Germans football match. But there were plenty of other things happening. And it was, you know, undoubtedly in defiance of, you know, what the authorities wanted. They didn't, on either side, they didn't want, you know, they were fighting a war, serious war to defeat the enemy. They didn't want the enemy becoming pals with your people.
Really, this is brave, splendid, and noble. Sir?
Yes, Lieutenant?
I'm scared, sir.
I'm scared too, sir.
I mean, I'm the last of the tiddly-winking leapfroggers from the golden summer of 1914. I don't want to die. Really, not over keen on dying at all, sir.
How are you feeling, darling?
Not all that good, Blackadder. Rather hoped I'd get through the whole show. Go back to work at Pratt & Sons. Keep wicket for the Croydon gentleman. Married Doris. Made a note in my diary on the way here. Simply says, Bucker.
Well, quite.
Come on, let's move.
Fix bayonets!
Don't forget your stick, Lieutenant.
Rather, sir. I wouldn't want to face a machine gun without this.
Isn't that a beautiful piece of writing? I think particularly the darling bit there, you know, keeping wicket and marrying Doris and going back to work. That's what people would have thought. And it's kind of, this is a point where it ceases to be a comedy and becomes a really affecting drama. You know, it's easy to criticize it for, you know, it's not historically right, but goodness, it smells right here. I mean, these are fine actors. You know, Tim McInerney there, I mean, he's beautifully doing it. He's about to go over the top and he's thinking about what's quite possibly never going to happen. A very ordinary life that's never going to happen.
Good luck, everyone.
Brilliant. You know, it paints a picture that I think is better than any drama. I mean, the mockery stops, the joke stops, they're all in it together, going over the top. I think it's worth pointing out that, you know, accuracy or not, the fact is people were going over the top. They were incredibly vulnerable. They were facing machine guns, and there was not very much they could do about it. They were incredibly vulnerable. So this idea, you know, how could I face a machine gun without my stick? You know, it makes its point. You know, trenches were essentially a defensive measure. It was easier to defend them than it was to attack them. So anybody who risked going at one was at a huge disadvantage. Thank you very much for watching. That was a lot of fun. It's a great series and I recommend you watch it if you haven't seen it already. So I'm Joshua Levine. I've written a couple of books about the First World War. I just happen to have one here. Forgotten Voices of the Somme, and I've also written Fighter Heroes of World War I, about the air war, specifically about the Royal Flying Corps. So please go and buy that. And if you like this, then subscribe to this channel. Thanks very much.